we have been studying the spiritual gifts, and hopefully we have gained some good insight into these gifts, and especially with our time last week, hopefully we've gained some insight into specifically how our gifts play out and how we can better put those to use. Now, one of the things that we're going to do as a part of our study is we're going to look at each of those gifts, because for each of those gifts, it's natural that we have questions. One of the questions I've heard is, how can women be apostles, and how can women score so highly on being pastor, shepherd? And we'll answer those questions in time, because each of those are important questions. Tonight, though, we're going to talk about an apostle. We're going to talk about the spiritual gift of an apostle. Now, the apostle is a gift for missions. In Ephesians 4, verse 11, it says, "And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers." So the question we need to ask is, what is an apostle? Because the definition is actually bigger than what we've always heard. When we say apostle, what's our instinctual answer? Instinctually, and the way we have been taught this, when we say apostle, we always think of the 12, and we kind of limit its meaning to the 12. Now, what I want you to see is the word apostle, the Greek word is apostolos, and it means one that is sent out, a messenger. And in fact, the word that's used in Revelation chapters 1, 2, and 3, when it talks about the angel of the church, for example, in Ephesus, that word angel there, angelos, and apostolos, come both from the same root word, and it means messenger. Now, most often, this refers to the 12, especially in the early part of the New Testament, the Gospels and Acts. But from the Acts forward, the term apostle gets a lot bigger. So first, let's look at Mark chapter 3, verses 14 through 18. If somebody will go ahead and read that for us. Mark chapter 3, 14 through 18.
And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, I guess.
That's good.
Son of Thunder, Andrew and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus the son of Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him.
Now, what I think so interesting about this is it says in the text what an apostle is. For Jesus, there was two qualifications: that they might be with him and that he could send them out. So that really helps us understand this most basic idea of apostle. It refers to the 12 that Jesus chose, and it refers to those 12 people that he chose to be with him, to travel with him, to be discipled by him, and also those 12 that he chose to send out on these limited commissions to preach, and eventually on the Great Commission to preach the gospel to the whole world. Now, somebody read Acts chapter 1, verses 24 through 26.
And they prayed and said, Thou Lord, which knowest the hearts of all men, show whether these two thou hast chosen, that he may take part of this ministry and apostleship, from which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go to his own place. And they gave forth their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles.
Thank you. Now, I think this also gives us some insight into apostles and how we should understand that. Now, he uses a term here that I think is important. He says they prayed and they said, Lord, you know which one you want, which one you have chosen to take place in this ministry and apostleship. So for the 12, it was more than just being an apostle. It was a special ministry where they had been with Jesus. They had spent time with Jesus. And in fact, later in the book of Acts in chapter 4, it literally says that the Pharisees and the priests took note that Peter and John had been with Jesus. So in a very serious way, we can say apostle refers to the 12 and primarily refers to the 12. But that's not the only use of the term, because ultimately the term or title of apostle is not limited to the 12. Now, somebody read 1 Corinthians 15, verses 5 through 7. All right, starting in verse 5, it says, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, I want you to get something. Do you see this distinction that's made in this passage?
Man,
Every time we've read this text, we always focus on the gospel and we focus on the resurrection and how Jesus appeared to each of these people. We talk about, he appeared to the apostles, he appeared to more than 500 people, some who are still alive, but we miss something that's significant in the text. It says he appeared to the 12 and he appeared to the apostles. Paul lists them as two separate groups. That's significant because it tells us that apostle was not limited to the 12. There was the 12 in a very special sense that Matthias was chosen to be a part of, but then there was also a group called the apostles or the other apostles. Now, repeatedly in the New Testament, we see these references to apostles who are not the 12. Somebody read Acts 14, verse 14.
But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting.
All right. Well, that just stops in a weird place, doesn't it?
Right.
Anyway, did you get what Paul says? Actually, what Luke says? He calls Paul and Barnabas apostles. That's significant. Paul and Barnabas were both considered apostles, and we don't often think of Barnabas as one of the apostles, but Luke did and Paul did. Now, let's turn to Romans 16, and this is where it's going to get challenging for you guys. Romans 16, somebody read verse 7 for us.
Romans 16, verse 17, verse 7. Greet, greet Andronicus and Junius with relatives who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was.
What translation are you reading from, Tara?
It's the NIV.
I like how it translated that phrase. They were outstanding among the apostles. Most translations don't use that phrase. And I point this out because there's a couple things you need to know. This passage is not actually translated from the Greek. They've changed several things in most English translations. Now, the first thing you need to know is the two names, Andronicus and Junia. In most translations, they're translated as male names, but in the Greek, they're both female. Now, do you know what that means?
Yes, you can be apostle. A woman can be apostle.
These two women were considered apostles, and they were considered outstanding among the apostles. They stood out, were of note. That phrase that Tara read, it said they were well known among the apostles, outstanding among the apostles. That's literally what the Greek text says. They are well known among the apostles, outstanding. In other words, there was a group of the 12 that were apostles, and they were apostles in a very special sense, hand-chosen by Jesus to be with him, to have a special ministry, and to be apostles sent out by Jesus. But there's also other people who are called apostles, and in fact, there was the 12 and there are apostles. Acts 14, we see Paul and Barnabas are called apostles, and here in Romans 16, we see two women named apostles. And not just that they're apostles, but that they're outstanding among the apostles, which means they were better than most. Now, that's significant for our understanding of who is and what is an apostle. Now, the rest of these texts we've got here, 2 Corinthians 8, Galatians 1, Philippians 2, 1 Thessalonians 1 and 2, and then Hebrews 13, we have a list of other people who are being called apostles. And in fact, in Hebrews 13, Jesus himself is called an apostle. So in 2 Corinthians 8, Paul and Titus are called apostles. In Galatians, James is called an apostle. In Philippians, Epaphroditus is called an apostle, even though it's translated, he's a messenger. The Greek word is literally apostle. Paul, Silas, and Timothy are called apostles. And then Jesus is called an apostle. Now, what does that all tell you?
They were all messengers?
They were all apostles, messengers in a sense. They were not the 12, but they were definitely apostles and were named as such. So here's my point. When we read these passages, we typically assume that apostle always refers to the 12. But we see in reading those that other people are called apostles. Men and women are called apostles. Jesus is called an apostle. Thus, I think it is appropriate for anyone who is specifically called by the church and by the Lord and being sent out by the church with the message or with a message to be called an apostle. As long as we understand that that doesn't mean one of the 12, I think that's a very appropriate term. Because in a sense, we're all called apostles. Under the Great Commission, what does Jesus tell each of us to do?
With the word.
He says, preach the word, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Is that a commissioning? Is that a being sent out into the world with a message?
Yes.
Absolutely it is. So I say all this because I want to impress upon us that the gift of an apostle is an enduring gift. It's something that's still present, and we actually see it playing out, though often we kind of are hesitant to use the term apostle. Apostles, in a very real sense, are still active. Now, that brings us to another important question. Who is an apostle? Now, as we took those tests, I'm sure a few people scored, relatively high on this gift of an apostle. So who does that really describe? Who is an apostle? Well, first, I would say an apostle describes the person who really deeply desires to start congregations where none others exist. That's how Paul described himself. Somebody read Romans 15, verses 20 and 21.
And thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation, but as it is written, those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand.
All right, so an apostle describes this person who has this passion, this deep desire to go out and preach the gospel, start congregations where none others exist, to go into areas like Paul said where nobody else has been yet. He didn't want to be someone who simply built on the foundation someone else laid for the church. He wanted to go where no foundation was at, build that foundation, establish that church. And in reality, we see in the book of Acts, Paul doing exactly that. You see him in 3 major missionary journeys, traveling through the known world, going to areas that had never seen or heard about Jesus, and preaching the gospel and establishing congregations. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote more than half of the New Testament. And in the first century, Paul had a hand in establishing hundreds of congregations. Now, the apostle is that person who really desires, who has this passion for preaching and for the congregation and working with them. They really feel Jesus's great commission in Matthew 28, 18 through 20 in a very passionate way, different from other people. I'm not going to read Matthew 28, but we all know the phrase, right? Jesus sends them out with this great commission to go into the world and preach the gospel. And he's told to preach, and they're told to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to teach them all things that he's commanded. And then he reminds them, I'm with you through this thing. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus tells his 12 that they're going to be his messengers, his witnesses, and they're going to start in Jerusalem and go to Judea and Samaria and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. And I say this to bring up this point. On one hand, we all have the responsibility to evangelize. On one hand, we all need to take the opportunities we have to speak about Jesus and evangelize. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean we're gifted as apostles or missionaries. You see, just because we have the responsibility to evangelize does not mean we're an apostle. Have you ever met someone who was uniquely an apostle, uniquely a missionary, uniquely someone whose passion was all about going where the gospel was not, to some other place, whether it be stateside or in foreign mission fields, and preaching the gospel? Personally, I've been blessed to know several passionate missionaries who were apostles by calling. It was in their blood, so to speak. One that I remember early on was a man named Craig Phillips. He was a member of the Wilkesboro Church of Christ. He was a missionary to India, and he spent most of his adult life doing mission work in India. At one point, he was kicked out of the country, his visa revoked. At other times, he would be in a church preaching the gospel, or in a room preaching the gospel, and people would break in, assault them. At one point, he was tied to the bumper of a car and dragged through the streets of the town. And then as soon as he could get out of the hospital, he went right back to do it again. He had a passion for mission work and apostleship that not everyone has. And that's why I say a missionary or an apostle possesses a unique ability to consistently hold to a Christian worldview and a worldview of his church. And ultimately, what I mean by that is that their motivations, what they want out of life and what they want with their faith, is very much focused on that thing. Now, with that understanding, we can all look at our own life and our own faith and our own passions and ask the question, have I really been given this gift of apostleship, this gift of mission work? Some of us can say, yeah, to a degree. I can say with absolute certainty that is not my gift. There is no doubt. I don't like anything that comes along with the idea of mission work. I like the idea of preaching, absolutely. I love the idea of teaching, absolutely. I love the idea of evangelism, absolutely. But going to these places and traveling and facing all these hardships is not something that I feel any passion to do whatsoever. I feel my passion toward the local church. Now, that brings up some important things we need to consider about missionaries. First, there's some positives. You see, a missionary, an apostle, has some positive attributes that really aid them in being a missionary. So first, they're visionary. And what I mean is they're not intimidated by the obstacles of the work. They're not intimidated by the struggle. They're not intimidated by the change. Instead, they're very motivated by those very things that would keep us or keep me from doing that very thing. In a sense, a missionary is visionary or a risk taker. They are gung-ho about going and doing this thing that not everyone else could do. A missionary, an apostle is adaptable. And what I mean is they can adapt to a different culture. They can adapt to different languages. They can adapt to different foods, different ways of thinking and doing things. They're actually excited about the prospect of travel and the prospect of new lands and new challenges and new ideas. A missionary is not materialistic. And what I mean is they generally don't have a whole lot and they generally don't want a whole lot. Their passion is tied up in one thing and one thing only. I want to go preach the gospel in places that hasn't heard it. I want to be the one there trying to establish this congregation. They're not interested in material things and they're not interested in money. They're blessed in a sense because they trust the Lord in a way that's a struggle for a lot of Christians. They believe Jesus Christ will always provide a way, even when everything else says there's no way. When all the evidence and all the proof says this won't work, the missionary's visionary, he's adaptable, he's not interested in money or accolades, he's not materialistic, and at his core, he's evangelistic. They have a heart for the lost, and they have a heart for seeing people come to the faith. And they tend to keep things simple, practical, quick, and Christ-centered, because ultimately the passion of an apostle, like we see in Paul in the book of Acts, is they go in, they preach the gospel, they establish a congregation, and then they move on. Now, with that comes some negatives. Believe it or not, there's some negatives involved in this. And I bring this up because it's important to understand if apostleship is your gift, you need to understand your positives and you need to understand and be aware of the negatives. For a negative, apostles can be impulsive. And what I mean is they're so driven by their passion that they don't take time to think through, to plan. They don't take time to consider what will and will not work. All they can think is I want to go and I'm ready to go. Let's go now. And that impulsiveness is actually a negative because far too often they're underfunded, which means they don't have nearly enough money to really do the job they need to do, but they don't care. All they care about is I want to get out there and do it. Most missionaries that I have known have been that person who's willing to operate on a shoestring budget and they don't care. Missionaries or apostles tend to be impractical. And what I mean is they tend to set their goals really, really high. They want to move very, very fast. And they tend to overwork themselves and try to do too much. Because again, they are so passionate about their calling and their gifting that all they can think is I want to go do this. And in a sense, that makes them impractical. On one hand, it makes them determined and they're going to keep going no matter what. But on the other hand, it's a bit impractical. And they can be a bit impatient because the truth is an apostle wants to go and establish and move on. So they tend to be impatient with older converts to the faith, which means they don't want to take the time to teach and nurture and grow someone into being a strong, solid Christian. They want to preach the gospel, establish it, move on. And that makes them kind of impatient. They can be impatient with new converts. They can be impatient with older converts. And they can be impatient with people who are not Christians at all. They want to do it and be done and move on. And it doesn't always work out that way. What I've seen in my lifetime is that it takes time to truly evangelize, and it takes time to truly convert someone. You can get them in the door pretty quickly, but it takes a lot of time. Some would say a lifetime to really nurture and grow a strong, faithful Christian. Now, there's some things that bring joy to an apostle. And if apostleship, missionary work is your gifting, there's some things you need to consider because they'll bring you real joy in your life and in your faith. And the first is go. Get involved. Go on a missionary trip. Go somewhere. Try it out. Get your hands dirty, so to speak. Nothing will be more satisfying to the apostle or missionary than actually doing it. Get involved, raise and support. And I say this because it's not always practical to go. It's not always possible to go. But you can still utilize your gift of apostleship by helping other people go, by helping raise support for them. You can do it within your local congregation, or you can do it on a more national scale. Help them raise the funds so they can go and be a part of that. Pray for apostles. Pray for those specific missionaries that you know, those teams you know. Encourage the church to be praying for those people. If apostleship is your passion, praying for apostles and missionaries ought to be your passion as well. And then get personally involved. And what I mean is support the people you know. If you don't know any apostles and missionaries, if you don't know who's actually out there doing the work, ask around. There's lots of missionaries here in North Carolina. I can name several here in Western North Carolina. Support them, write letters, send emails, call them up, send gift packages. Help support the people who are actually doing it. Not only should you raise financial support, you should support them emotionally, physically, spiritually, and just as important to get involved. And what I mean is, the passion of an apostle is establishing and preaching and working with people who've not heard the gospel. But there's a sense in which that can be done right where you're at. Every one of us is not gifted with the gift of apostleship, but every one of us is surrounded by people who've never heard the gospel. We're surrounded by people who are not Christians. Go door knocking. Get involved in home Bible studies. Get involved in a benevolence work where you can help people who are in need. Those will be sources of joy for you, especially in your gifting. Now, with that, we've seen the strengths and the weaknesses of an apostleship. We've seen ways to find joy and encourage that gift. But we also need to know that because apostles or missionaries are who they are, there's some important people that they need to be friends with, partners with. There's some people they need to be closely connected with who will, in a sense, shore up their weak areas. Not everyone is a 5-talent person. Not everyone is gifted in all the gifts, which means we're going to have weaknesses in certain areas. An apostle is no exception. They're going to need leaders, administrators. You see, these people are important for the missionary because they're often more heart than planning. They're more heart than the ability to actually carry out their grand vision for what they're called to do. The leader administrator is going to work well with a missionary because they'll take the time to think through the vision, to plan the vision, to finance the vision. And that's often what makes the difference between success and failure for an apostle, for a missionary. An evangelist is an important partner for the missionary because the evangelist gets along with an apostle very well. And in fact, they're kind of cut from the same cloth. They both have a passion for preaching and evangelizing. They both want to see new people come to the faith and be Christians. So in a sense, evangelists and missionaries work really well together and inspire and encourage each other. If apostleship is your gifting, then you need to be friends with someone who's gifted as an apostle or as an evangelist, because that will be a source of joy and encouragement and inspiration in your life. A well-trained evangelist can develop their skills by working with a missionary, which often just makes them better. Now, a teacher is also an important partner for the missionary, because the missionary wants to move on, and they need a teacher who can stay, who can encourage and teach, build up that new convert. While the missionary is great at making converts, he's not good at growing converts. The teacher is. They're good at presenting God's word in such a way that people are inspired to reach for more, to grow, to become stronger in the faith. And then the missionary, the apostle, needs pastors, shepherds. Now, I put pastor, elder. Pastor, shepherd, elder, those words are used synonymously at times, and they're used in different senses at times. And we'll get into that more when we consider that specific gift. But a good pastor, shepherd is important to the missionary because he often gravitates to a work, to an area where there is no church, or if there is a church, it's very weak there. And this pastor, elder, shepherd can give structure. He can give support. He can give longevity to the vision and dream in the work of that missionary. The pastor shepherd actually provides something that's lacking for the missionary, and that is patience and encouragement. Shepherds are really good at that. They're patient with young and old alike. They're encouraging, they're strengthening, and they're very good at supporting those who are not doing so well. No missionary team or no missionary is complete without a good connection to a pastor, shepherd, elder. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the gift of evangelism, the gift of proclamation. So before we end tonight, does anyone have a questions about apostleship and that gifting?
What part do you consider the sojourners?
The sojourners, I would consider them missionaries, because they're going to weaker congregations and working with them, helping them strengthen areas where they might be struggling.
We knew a couple in Murphy that were sojourners.
Absolutely. When I was a deacon at Lenore Church of Christ, we had the sojourners come in, and they stayed for a week and did some really extraordinary work with us there. They were very important to our success. There's another group, and I believe this is the group where in the same hometown where Christy and Aaron live. It's called Home Mission, and their whole mission is going to these churches of Christ where they're very small and they're struggling, and they go in and help reinstitute evangelism, reestablish these congregations, and that work is really encouraging as well. Anyone else have questions?